For 30 years, people thought the story of where Japanese people came from was already settled. Two ancestral groups, one very old and one more recent, mixing together on an island chain. The genetic recipe was written in textbook after textbook. Then, in 2021, a team drilling into pieces of an ancient skull pulled out something the textbooks never expected. A third ancestor, one that had gone completely unnoticed, and a founding population so deeply isolated from the rest of humanity that its closest genetic relatives live not across the sea in Korea, not in nearby China, but on the faraway plateaus of Tibet. If that sounds impossible, it is because the story of Japanese DNA is unlike anything geneticists have found anywhere else on Earth. And the reason it took this long to notice, it has nothing to do with the evidence being hidden. It has everything to do with where scientists were looking. To understand what changed, you first need to understand what everybody believed and why it felt so certain. In 1991, the physical anthropologist Kazuro Hanihara published what became known as the dual structure model. He had spent years comparing skulls and teeth from archaeological sites across the Japanese archipelago, measuring jaw angles, skull widths, tooth patterns, collecting thousands of data points, and the conclusion was simple and elegant. Modern Japanese people, he argued, were the result of two populations mixing. First, the Jomon, indigenous hunter-gatherers who had lived on the islands for over 10,000 years, building settlements, making the world's oldest known pottery, firing clay pots at the Odi Yamamoto site in Aomori more than 16,000 years ago. 2 full thousand years before anyone in Mesopotamia made a pot. And second, the Yayoi, migrants who crossed from the Korean Peninsula around 900 BCE, bringing with them the knowledge of wet rice farming that would change Japanese society from scattered foragers into organized farming communities. So the dual model was neat. It explained the archaeological record beautifully. Walk through any major Japanese museum today, and the story appears on the shelves. Jomon skulls with broad faces, strong brow ridges, and deep-set eyes sit beside Yayoi full, more refined, and clearly closer to modern East Asian features. The physical difference is visible to the naked eye. And the Jomon looked different from the people who came after them, and the teeth said the same thing. Jomon tooth patterns matched a structure called sundodonty, common in Southeast Asia, while Yayoi teeth showed synodonty linked to Northeast Asian populations. Genetic studies through the 1990s and the 2000s kept supporting it, finding exactly the two-part signal Hanihara predicted. The Ainu people of Hokkaido and the Ryukyuans of Okinawa, separated by over 3,000 kilometers at opposite ends of the archipelago, clustered together genetically, both carrying higher traces of Jomon ancestry than mainland Japanese. That geographic pattern, two outlier populations bookending the islands, fit the model perfectly. But here is the problem with a theory that fits perfectly. Nobody checks what it might be missing. The dual model had a blind spot, and it was built into the tools. Classic genetic markers, blood groups, serum proteins, and enzyme variants that researchers had used since the 1960s could spot big population differences, but they did not have the detail needed to separate closely related waves of migration that arrived centuries apart. If two genetically similar groups entered Japan at different times, those older methods would mix them into one signal. Meanwhile, the few ancient DNA studies that existed in the early 2000s focused almost entirely on Jomon remains. The Yayoi period had only a small number of samples, and the Kofun period, the imperial transition from about 300 to 700 C that saw the rise of centralized power, huge keyhole-shaped burial mounds, and the arrival of Chinese writing in Japan. 0 genomes. Not one Kofun person had ever been sequenced. An entire era of Japanese history, 4 centuries of major cultural change, was a blank page in the genetic record. That blank page is exactly where the old model fell apart, and the reasons it stayed blank were not random. They were structural. Japan's climate is warm and humid, terrible conditions for ancient DNA to survive. Bones that would give excellent DNA in the cold caves of Europe or the dry deserts of Central Asia were often damaged beyond use in Japanese soil. Add to that the fact that many Kofun-era burial sites, especially the massive keyhole-shaped tombs called Kofun, are labeled as imperial property by the Japanese government. They are protected, unexcavated, and legally off-limits. Researchers could not sequence what they could not reach. And there was an even quieter problem too. Because the dual model fit the available data so well, there was little pressure from institutions to look farther. When a model works, you stop testing it. When it explains the Ainu, the Rukwans, and the mainland pattern, why would you think a third ingredient was missing? If you only compare point A and point C, you might decide the difference between them is simple. But if you never look at point B, you cannot know what happened in between. And what happened in between, it turns out, was the single largest genetic event in Japanese history. The team that finally looked was led by Shigeki Nakagome, a genomic medicine researcher at Trinity College Dublin, working alongside Takashi Arai at Kanazawa University. Their work started not with a big theory, but with a specific kind of bone, not a thigh bone, not a rib, the petrous bone, a small dense pyramid of bone deep inside the inner ear, no bigger than the last joint of your thumb. It is the toughest bone in the human body. It is so packed that bacteria and moisture struggle to get inside. Because it is so dense, it keeps ancient DNA much better than any other bone. In warm, humid places like Japan, where organic material breaks down quickly in acidic soil, this difference is crucial. Earlier attempts to pull DNA from Japanese archaeological sites often produced less than 1% usable genetic material, basically noise. The petrous bone changed the situation completely. Working in special clean rooms at both Kanazawa University and Trinity College Dublin, the team carefully drilled into petrous bones and one tooth from 14 ancient individuals dug up from 6 sites spread across western and central Japan. The oldest, a woman from Iim Prefecture, had been dead for 9,000 years. The newest, 3 skeletons from Ishikawa Prefecture, dated to the Kofun period, only 1,500 years ago. Those 3 Kofun genomes would become the first ever made from that era. Before we see what their evidence shows, if this discovery is pulling you in, subscribe so you do not miss future episodes where the evidence changes what we thought we knew. 12 of the 14 samples produced usable sequences. 9 Jomon, 3 Kofun, and when the data came back, it did not fit the dual model. The statistical tool they used is called QP-Wave, which tests whether an observed population can be explained as a mix of known ancestral sources. For the Yayoi period individuals, a two-way admixture of Jomon and Northeast Asian ancestry fit neatly. But for the Kofun individuals, that same two-source model failed. The math said no, something else was there. A third ancestral component, one with strong genetic closeness to Han Chinese populations from the Yellow River and West Yao River regions. The researchers then ran a 3-way admixture model, Jomon plus Northeast Asian plus East Asian, and the Kofun data clicked into place. What does that mean in plain terms? It means that sometime around 300 CE, a new wave of people arrived in the Japanese archipelago, likely from the southern Korean Peninsula, carrying ancestry that was genetically different from both the Jomon and the earlier Yayoi migrants. These were not just a few traders or diplomats. Their genetic footprint is huge. About 71% of modern mainland Japanese ancestry traces to this Kofun-era influx. 13% traces to the original Jomon, 16% to the Yayoi. The group that arrived last left the biggest mark. 3 lines of evidence make this hard to ignore. First, what the genomes show. The Kofun individuals need a 3-source model, while the Yayoi individuals do not. This is not a matter of opinion or fuzzy statistics. Second, what the finding rules out. If the Kofun transition had been only cultural new ideas spreading without new people, then the genetic profile of Kofun-era individuals should look like Yayoi individuals, with maybe small changes over time. Instead, they carry a large component that does not exist in any Yayoi sample. Random genetic drift does not create that. Slow mixing over a few generations does not create that. Only a big movement of people does. Third, what it suggests. The Kofun period was when Japan changed from a set of farming communities into a centralized state. Huge burial mounds were built for a new ruling class. Chinese characters showed up on metal tools, swords, and mirrors. Political systems appeared that would shape the islands for centuries. For century. Now, we know this cultural revolution happened alongside a population one. It was not just ideas crossing the strait, it was people. But the three-part model raises as many questions as it answers. Some are still truly unsolved. The Kofun individuals sequenced in this study were not buried in the giant keyhole-shaped mounds saved for elites. They were lower-ranking people, ordinary members of society. This means we still do not know the genetic profile of the Kofun ruling class. Were they the migrants themselves? Were they descendants of the earlier Yasuo elite who adopted continental customs? To answer that, someone would have to sequence remains from inside the Great Tombs, and many of those are protected as imperial property, off-limits to digging by Japanese law. There is also a deeper mystery about the Jomon themselves, and it comes before any question about the Kofun. Their lineage split from all other East Asian populations between 20,000 and 15,000 years ago, so long ago that it happened before the split of the ancestors of modern Chinese, Koreans, and even Native Americans. When you place Jomon DNA on a phylogenetic tree, they branch off before almost every other East Asian group, sitting on a branch so old it reaches close to the base of the whole East Eurasian family. They are not just a local version of some bigger population. They are a leftover of one of the earliest waves of humans to reach the Pacific coast, and yet their closest living genetic relatives are not their geographic neighbors. The Ainu of Hokkaido carry about 79% Jomon-like ancestry. The Ryukyuans of Okinawa carry about 28%. But across the sea, the population that shares the most surprising closeness to the Jomon is the indigenous peoples of Taiwan, suggesting an ancient coastal migration route from Southeast Asia that followed the Pacific Rim thousands of years before rice farming existed. Then there is Haplogroup D. On the Y chromosome, Japanese men carry a lineage called DM55 at a remarkably high rate. Outside Japan, you can hardly find it. Not in Korea, not in China, not in Southeast Asia, where Michael Hammer's surveys of over 1,000 men across 20 populations found 0 carriers. The only other population on Earth where a closely related branch of haplogroup D appears at similar levels is Tibetan men living on a plateau 5,000 km, separated by oceans, deserts, and the full width of China. The two branches are thought to have split about 50,000 years ago. That is not a match you can explain by recent contact. It is a ghost signal from a migration so old it happened before the last glacial maximum, a trace of movement along paths that no longer exist, through landscapes that are now ocean floor. Meanwhile, the Jomon population itself stayed extraordinarily small. Modeling based on runs of homozygosity in an 8,800-year-old Jomon individual suggests an effective population of only 1,000 people kept for thousands of years. 1,000 on an island chain stretching 4,000 km. They were not just isolated. They were one of the most genetically bottlenecked populations of modern humans ever recorded, and yet they survived, adapted, and invented pottery technology before almost any civilization on Earth. Today, across the Japanese archipelago, the amounts of these 3 ancestral layers change in ways you can map prefecture by prefecture. In Okinawa, Jomon ancestry reaches 28.5%, in the northeast around 19%. In western Japan, closer to the Korean Peninsula and the historical entry point for continental migrants, it drops to 12%. The pattern is not random. It is the geographic fingerprint of wave after wave of migration, each pushing farther into the islands, each mixing more or less depending on mountains, distance, and time. If this hidden chapter of Japan's origins interested you, subscribe to stay with us as the ancient DNA revolution keeps rewriting histories we thought were finished. Somewhere in a university lab, the petrous bone of a Kofun-era skeleton still holds sequences no one has read. The tombs of the ruling class are still sealed, and inside the DNA of 125 million living Japanese people, 3 ancient populations continue their silent conversation, a conversation that was invisible until someone thought to listen for a third voice. The Jomon survived for over 10,000 years with a population of about 1,000. They invented the world's oldest pottery and carried a genetic lineage that connects them to Tibet and Taiwan, but almost nowhere in between. So here is the question that still has no answer. If the Jomon were among the earliest modern humans to reach East Asia, taking a coastal route from the south tens of thousands of years ago, what happened to all the other populations that must have traveled alongside them?